As Illinois approaches its bicentennial celebration, the Illinois Channel takes a look at the people, events, and landmarks that make up Illinois' rich history.
Next, from August of 2010, we go in depth with David Ellis, Counsel to House Speaker Michael Madigan, about the sequence of the historic events that led to the impeachment of Rod Blagojevich. We'll hear how the case against the governor was organized in the House and Senate when there was no precedent to follow. This runs about 90 minutes. David Ellis, Counsel to House Speaker Michael Madigan. Thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Well, thank you, Terry.
As we tape this, it's August 11th, 2010, and Rod Blagojevich, the former governor of Illinois, is awaiting a jury decision. We may have a jury decision by the time this airs, but just so the viewers know that we don't know what their findings were at this time.
Right.
But we thought it would be interesting, both in light of the governor's trial as well as just for historical purposes, to have a conversation with you as the prosecutor of Rod Blagojevich in the impeachment in the Senate, of what events transpired and how it came to your attention that the governor's alleged actions were brought about. And so let's walk through that, if we might. And first, let's just back up a little bit and tell us just a little bit about who David Ellis is and how you came to work with House Speaker Michael Madigan.
Oh, well, I've been a lawyer since 1993, and in about 1999, after being in private practice in Chicago, I decided to do some work down here in Springfield. My good friend Rob Huey had become the Speaker's chief counsel, and I was up in Chicago a little bored with just your everyday commercial litigation, and Rob and I got to talking, and he said, why don't you come down and try this out? So I worked for the Speaker as an assistant lawyer for a couple of years and got to know him, and I think earned his trust, and then returned to Chicago, returned to private practice, but kept in touch with the Speaker and did some legal work for the Democratic Party. Some pretty big voting rights cases and the like, the redistricting cases. And, you know, back in 2006, he called and said, I'd like you to come down here and be my chief counsel. So that's what I did.
Little did you know what you were getting into with that.
Right. And it was funny because when he hired me, he said, you know, Dave, you're accustomed to sort of, you know, high-end, you know, high-profile litigation, and that's not what you're going to be getting in this job. Little did we know that in my first year arriving here, the governor would sue the Speaker twice, the only two times in the history of our state, and then, of course, a couple years later, the impeachment trial, which is about as high profile as you get.
Do you remember the first time you met Rod Blagojevich, and was it when you were working with the Speaker, or had you met him before then?
I'd never met him before. I can count on one hand the number of times I was in the same room with Rod Blagojevich while he was governor.
What was your, I mean, before all that transpired came about, what were your impressions early on of Rod Blagojevich?
Negative. We didn't trust him. We didn't trust his motives. We didn't trust his methods. We were very skeptical of anything he did. And we treaded very cautiously around him. The Speaker, very early on in my tenure, of course he'd been here for a long time, essentially adopted the policy that he wouldn't be in the same room with Rod Blagojevich without a witness. And he didn't even really want to be in the same room with him, period, because we just thought everything he was doing had a corrupt end to it. I don't necessarily mean corrupt in the legal sense. Nobody knew if he was actually breaking laws, but we were certainly very wary of him. And so that made it very difficult to run state government when the Speaker can't trust the governor. And of course the governor and the Senate president at that point had become allied. Emil Jones and Governor Blagojevich were quite close, and so that made it even more difficult for us to get anything done. We would correspond with emails, by paper, you know, but very, very little face-to-face interactions. And when we did interact face-to-face, it usually did not go well.
You know, I think this is significant because we are, as a state, aside from the whole impeachment area that we'll get into, but I mean, we are in the troubles that we are in.
Yeah.
Many people thought the state was adrift under Governor Blagojevich's tenure.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
to the extent that state government became dysfunctional. I mean, let's explore this just a little bit more, because what was it about dealing with him that left that impression that Speaker Madigan did not want to be in the room with him alone, or even deal with him much at all if he could avoid it?
Yeah. It was everything you heard down here. You talked to people who tried to get bills signed by the governor. You talked to people who were contacted about fundraising. Everybody thought he was doing things the wrong way for the wrong reasons. You know, Chris Kelly comes in and takes over the gaming operations, and Tony Resco has a big say in things that are going on around here, even though he holds no public position. The political arm was clearly dictating everything from our perspective. And, you know, if he were just a political guy, I guess you could live with that. But when he started blending the two things together, we start getting into areas where we have to be very careful. There's always a tension. There's money in politics, and you only support people who financially support people who are going to adopt your positions. That only makes sense. If I'm pro-choice and that's my issue, then I'm going to give money to pro-choice candidates, not to pro-life candidates. So we all understand that there is some relationship between policy and politics, but when it becomes a quid pro quo, you've crossed the line where it becomes, I will only take this official action if you give me a campaign contribution. Everybody thought that was going on. Nobody knew the details. You know, when December 9th, 2008 came around, nobody that I know of was aware that he was, you know, putting the Senate seat up for sale or dealing with the Chicago Tribune. We didn't know the specifics of, you know, Children's Memorial Hospital or Johnny Johnson and the racetracks, but all of those things in a generic way we thought he was doing. We just weren't sure how. One way that really hurt, this poor relationship hurt, was with the capital bill. You know, the Speaker wanted a capital projects bill as much as anybody. You know, we needed to do things around the state. But could you imagine just giving hundreds of billions of dollars to Governor Blagojevich to spend? We couldn't do it. We just couldn't do it. And so we were sitting there trying to find unique ways to run a capital program, to run it maybe through the Secretary of State or something, to do something that had never been done. I felt like most of what I was doing my first year were things that were unprecedented. Well, we've never done this before, but could we do it this way? Because we have such a bad governor, we can't go through him. We were always trying to find ways around him so we could do the people's business but not have to rely on him. If you relied on him, it just, you know, it wasn't going to turn out well.
You know, it was said at the time by some here as we sit in the Capitol, and people obviously talk about who the personalities are, that there was the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and then there was Rod Blagojevich. And it wasn't as if the Democrats really were necessarily getting along with Governor Blagojevich. Not really.
They weren't. I think I always used to look at the Senate, which I didn't know very well. Still don't know the senators all that well. It's not my chamber, but and you know, I looked at a lot of them and thought, you know, Emil Jones was very close with the governor, but most of them were not with Emil Jones on that. I didn't think. You can't speak generally. There's some exceptions, but you know.
And the governor did not have many allies in the House Democratic caucus.
No, he had one very notable ally, and then he had a few others that I would say would support him if in crunch time. You could count on one hand the number of House Democrats who supported him, and my guess is it was a very small number in the Senate. It just happened to be Senate leadership. Yeah, it was a very odd relationship.
So it held up the Capitol bill for obvious reasons. I mean, as you mentioned, people just didn't trust to give him the leeway to spend that kind of money.
I mean, Terry, it played with everything, you know. The Capitol bill, the ways to fund the Capitol bill, you know, like a gaming board. Well, we said, okay, if we're going to expand gambling, if we're even going to consider expanding casinos and slots at the tracks and things like that, we want a gaming board that the governor couldn't pollute. We set up a whole different thing that we'd never done before with a nomination panel, and where every constitutional officer had some say in it. Everything we were doing was to the end of trying to distance it from the governor. And everything he was doing and Emil Jones was doing was trying to unwind what we were doing. But, you know, everything that, you know, screwing in a light bulb took 20 meetings because we wanted to screw in a light bulb without the governor touching it, and he wanted to be in the room alone with the light bulb. I mean, it was that kind of a crazy thing. Every budget was the same way. You know, we'd pass a budget and we'd try to agree with the Senate, okay, this is the budget we want, and then the governor would go in that budget and slash everything the House Democrats wanted.
You know, I was going to say, you're the counsel for the House Speaker, so I may ask you certain questions that you don't want to answer, and that's understandable if I go into there. But Speaker Madigan must have been extremely frustrated, and as reporters, I mean, we were the budget's supposed to be wrapped up at the end of May.
Yeah.
It was drifting into August, and September, where nothing was getting done, no meetings, you didn't know. And then I forget which year it was, because we had multiple years like this where it seemed like Speaker Madigan just said, well, here's what we're going to do, and then we're going to go home. Yeah, we had to do that at times. The budget was, it was very frustrating, to answer your question. What was frustrating also was the amount of blame that we were taking for it. People were blaming the Speaker for not meeting with Blagojevich and working with him. And what I think some people might have known in the back of their minds, but not as much as they might realize now, is it was impossible to work with him. It was impossible to make a deal with someone whose word you couldn't trust. He could look you in the eye and tell you something, and the next day he would do something different. You know, I mean, the Speaker, you know, if you're Speaker for as long as he's been, there are going to be some critics and some supporters. But even his critics will say if he tells you he's going to do something, he does it. If he shakes your hand and says, I will do ABC, you can take it to the bank. Blagojevich, couldn't do that. So how do you deal with someone like that? When you know, George Ryan, okay, so George Ryan had his faults. We know that he's in prison. We know he was accused of some crimes and convicted of them. I hardly know the man. I can't speak to that. But I do recall when I was on staff, and he was the governor at the time, if he made a deal with you, it was a deal. You know, the legislators liked working with Governor Ryan to the extent that you could make an agreement with him and he would stick to it. With Rod Blagojevich, you had no idea what was going to happen after you left the room. I want to move along pretty soon here, but did anyone ever confront the governor? Did you ever have a coming to Jesus meeting and saying, hey, every time you tell us something, then you back off, if we're going to run this government, we need to be able to have you stick to a deal?
We did without being that direct. I mean, you may recall, Terry, before my time, we started a doctrine, a concept called a memorandum of understanding. And so we would pass a budget with some member projects in it. So some state representative would want to have a local school get a new roof put on it or some roads paved, that kind of thing. The governor would say, okay, I'll do it. And we'd say, well, no, it's not enough just that you are saying that to us. We want it in writing, Governor. And so we had all these memoranda of understanding where the governor would say, I agree that I'm going to use this amount of money for this road project. That itself speaks to the profound mistrust that we had to do that. By the end, when I stepped in, by the time I got here, which is essentially 2007, we weren't even doing memoranda of understanding anymore. The relationship was so poisonous, we didn't even pretend to trust him.
Let's move along then. I mean, we could explore that. There's much to talk about, but time's always the enemy. We come then, Barack Obama is elected President of the United States.
Yeah.
And we get past the November elections. It's early December. And why don't you just tell us what transpired, how did you come to hear about the governor's arrest, and then what happened after that internally within the Speaker's office?
It was December 9th, 2008. I was at home. It was about 7:30, 8 in the morning. I was just getting ready for another day of work, and my sister-in-law in Iowa called me and said, actually talked to my wife. My wife kind of yelled to me from the bathroom, my sister is on the phone, and she said, you should turn on the television, the governor's been arrested. And so I turned on CNN, and I saw what everybody else saw, Rod Blagojevich in handcuffs, federal agents taking him away, allegations running across the scroller of the screen about a Senate seat, selling a Senate seat. You know, I just had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. I called the chief of staff right away. Tim Mapes, the chief of staff to the Speaker. Yeah, my immediate report is Tim Mapes. I called him. I told him what had happened. I spoke with the Speaker later that day. He was not in town. He was not in Illinois. And
How did
Yeah,
may I ask how the Speaker reacted?
The Speaker is a man of few words. He likes to digest things before he shoots off at the mouth. That's one of the many differences between him and Governor Blagojevich. He actually thinks before he speaks. And so his first reaction was just to get as much information as he could. And we talked later. None of us knew what was going to happen. My first reaction was that the governor was going to resign. A foolish thought, but that was my first thought. And my second thought was that if he didn't resign, that there were going to be impeachment proceedings. I didn't know if it would result in his impeachment, much less his removal, but I knew that there would be an incredible cry for his impeachment after he'd been arrested by federal agents. There was really no doubt that that was at least going to be a topic of conversation. I don't remember specifically at this point when I first got into the nuts and bolts with the Speaker about what was going to come next. I had not researched impeachment all that much. I was obviously generally aware of our powers to impeach. I had looked at it a little bit, but not really very much. Even though the words impeachment and Blagojevich had gone together for quite some time in the Capitol, I had never been actively told, start getting anything ready. So I had a lot of work to do.
So to be clear on that point, it wasn't as if Speaker Madigan had been looking for some excuse to impeach the governor.
Oh, not at all. No. We had no active plans to do that. My job is to be ready.
I think it's good for the historical record just to lay out what was thought of and what wasn't thought
well,
of, despite the poisonous relationships.
That's an interesting point you make, Terry. You know, you look back historically, you look at Andrew Johnson, who was the first United States president impeached, only the second one ever and the first of two. And really there's a story behind his impeachment. He was impeached for certain things, but really the story behind it is that they didn't like how he was handling Reconstruction after the Civil War. People weren't in love with Rod Blagojevich before he was impeached, but we had there were no active plans to do it. Some people talked about it here and there, but there was never any active movement afoot. And to his credit, the Speaker, who was clearly not a friend of the governor's, we put the institution and the process before the politics. The easiest thing in the world for the Speaker would have been to say, that same day, okay, let's start impeachment proceedings, but he didn't. We actually waited 6 days, and during those 6 days the Speaker thought about what he wanted to do. It wasn't unilaterally up to him, but he thought about what he wanted to do. He didn't say on day one, okay, we're going to impeach him, or we're going to have the proceedings even. He wanted to give the governor some breathing room in case the governor wanted to take some action of his own. He wanted to think about it, to just take some time and consider what we should do. He wanted me to look into it and start giving him some advice about how this might go. We were approaching Christmas. It was the end of a calendar year. A new General Assembly was going to be starting the following January. All these things come into play.
Which at that point, in other words, the new General Assembly was going to be sworn in about 3 weeks from that point.
Something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so
did anyone say maybe we should send an emissary to the governor and propose that he resign?
Not that I know of. We would have never done something like that. We weren't talking to the governor's office.
With the relationship, maybe that would have stopped him from resigning even if he had thought about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our Constitution gives the governor more than one option. He doesn't have to choose between staying in office and resigning. He could have temporarily stepped down. A lot of people don't know that. I'm sure he knew that. I'm sure somebody must have told him that at some point. I hope they did. Where he could step down temporarily because he's unable to assume the duties of office. That provision's never been utilized. You tend to think that would happen if you had a stroke or you were stricken with cancer and had to take some time off for chemotherapy or something like that. But the truth is you could have probably declared a disability and stepped down, kept your salary, kept your job technically, and Pat Quinn would have become the acting governor as opposed to governor. He could have done that. He could have done that the first day, and I'll always wonder what would have happened had he done that. Had he said, I'm innocent, I'm going to prove these charges to be false, but right now the state needs a governor who's not distracted. So rather than resign, I'm just going to step down temporarily. I'm going to invoke that provision. I'm going to let the lieutenant governor become acting governor so the state doesn't miss a bump. And one day if I, when I prove myself, I clear myself of these charges, I will I'll resume office again. Had he done that, would he have damped down the stampede? I don't know, maybe. We'll never know, right? So he didn't take that. So we just sat there for a few days. I was quietly doing my research and talking to the Speaker about how things might work. He was, I think, giving Rod Blagojevich some time to do the right thing. And we got criticized heavily for waiting 6 days. We got beaten up in the press every day. You know, why isn't this happening? But you know, the Speaker puts the institution first. I mean, that's why I decided to leave private practice and come down here and work for him. You know, I'm not trying to be his cheerleader, but this is exactly the kind of thing that makes me glad that I work for him. He cared more about the institution and the process, historical precedent. So we're sitting here today talking about this, Terry, for, you know, for the sake of, you know, 60 years from now, somebody hearing this, and they can know that, you know, we did it the right way. We put the institution first.
So the week goes by, and the governor has not resigned, and then what happens? How did we get to what was interesting? And we can walk through this. Is that we actually had 2 votes in the House for impeachment. Yeah. The first was in December, I believe, wasn't it?
Correct. That's right.
So how did we move forward after that first week?
The first thing we had to do was create a committee, and we had to decide the composition of that committee and how that was going to work. And you know, the Speaker from his side said, to make this the most non-political, you know, committee that I can do, I'm going to go by seniority. So his appointees, the House Democratic members, were by seniority. They were the people who'd been there the longest. There's a pretty obvious reason why you'd want the most senior people. But he didn't necessarily pick the most ravenous critics of the governor, which would have been an easy thing to do. And in fact, some of the governor's most ravenous critics from the House Democratic side were not on the committee and wanted to be on. But the Speaker said, I'm just going to go by seniority. I don't think Tom Cross went by seniority, but he picked perfectly good people. I'm not critical of his choices. In fact, I ended up working with him very well. So we had a committee, and then we had to decide on what to do. We had to decide, for example, what were going to be the offenses or the potential acts of wrongdoing that we were going to investigate. That's where some of my historical research came in. You know, what is an impeachable offense? Gerald Ford, when he was the minority leader of the House, had a famous statement that an impeachable offense is whatever a majority of the House says it is at any given moment in history. He said that in the context of when Supreme Court Justice William Douglas was being considered for impeachment, a very liberal justice who some people weren't fond of. And Gerald Ford was right. Our Constitution gives even more leeway than the U.S. Constitution gives. You just have to have cause for impeachment. So my job was to look at the case law, what little there was, to dust off some of the old impeachments. Been very few governmental impeachments in U.S. history.
And
only
none
2.
in Illinois, so again, you were not looking at Illinois.
Right. We did investigate Justice Heupel for impeachment in 1999, but other than that, you're right. You have to go back to, there was really no active impeachment that ever took place in the state's history.
And by the way, at the federal level, when you bring up Gerald Ford,
Yeah.
The U.S. Constitution says high crimes and misdemeanors, which again is rather nebulous.
Yes.
But the Illinois Constitution doesn't even say that, right?
Correct. It used to say misdemeanors, and when they rewrote the Constitution in 1970, they took out misdemeanors. The main reason they took it out was that it no longer had the same meaning. Misdemeanors means wrongdoing. It used to mean that, at least. Now it means a parking ticket, so they didn't want to do that. But what's interesting is when they took out misdemeanors, they didn't replace it. The framers of the 1970 Constitution, because of course, Terry, I spent a lot of time studying this.
And we should say you were a constitutional lawyer, right?
Yeah, constitutional law is really my specialty. The framers of the Constitution thought about putting in phrases like official misconduct, and they ultimately said, you know, anything we put in is going to tie the hands of the legislature. Why tie the hands? Let them do what they think is right, and then have to answer for it politically. And so it's just cause for impeachment. Those are the only words you have to determine from the Illinois Constitution. No burden of proof, not beyond a reasonable doubt or preponderance of the evidence, just whatever you think is cause for impeachment. So, you know, people say, well, how did you settle on the things you settled on in terms of investigating? How did you come up with those? And what I always said was the harder part was shortening the list, not making the list. We cut out all sorts of stuff that people wanted to investigate the governor for. There were
Why did you shorten it? Was that a matter of just efficiency and time?
No, I really wouldn't say that. It was really more policy decisions. You know, we knew that anything we investigated him for would become precedent. Obviously, we were going to investigate him for the acts for which he had a criminal accusation pending, and there were a lot of them. Pay-for-play allegations for the most part. There was also things like some of his attempts to go around the legislature, you know, a health care program without running it through the legislature. All of these things like prescription drug programs that sounded good on paper but really were, he knew he couldn't do it. He was told he couldn't do it. In some cases he was ordered by the federal government not to do it, but then he did it anyways so he could have a press release, which is fine for him, but then it cost the state $100 million or something. These kind of things, prescription drug programs and health care things, these sort of other issues besides criminal issues were the things that we grappled with. You know, to what extent did we want to go down the road? His abuse of the Freedom of Information Act, for example. You know, you're in the press, Terry. He was legendary for his absolute trampling of FOIA. Trampled it. We ultimately, I don't believe, impeached him. I'm tapping my memory bank. I'm pretty sure we did not impeach him on that. Why? Because we just made a policy determination. We just wanted to cut, you had to cut it off somewhere, and that's where the line was drawn. 13 different acts were the basis for his impeachment. And we had a list that was 30 or 40 at some point. People were constantly, members of the committee, people who weren't members of the committee, hey, can you look at this? Can you look at this? All his hiring fraud, can you look at that? You know? So we investigated more than 13 things, probably more like 16 or 17. We impeached him on about 13. So you mentioned, you know, the final action of the committee. We had to write up a report, and I wrote up a report, and we guarded that report like we've never guarded anything around here that I've seen. We were very concerned about it getting leaked. You know what this place is like. It's a sieve. We had, now I'm not going to remember how many members we had on the committee, but we had a pretty good-sized committee, like 19 or 20 or something like that. And so how do you keep all those people from leaking? So we literally would not let them take the report out of the room. I drafted the report. I had some help, but I predominantly drafted it myself. And then we held a meeting in one of the Capitol building rooms here. Over the Christmas holiday, basically, and the members came and they could sit down, they got their copy that had a number on it, and they couldn't leave until they'd given that copy back. They made whatever suggestions they wanted. They sat with me as much as they wanted. I was there all day. They could say, Dave, I don't like this part, this is, we need more, you know, that kind of thing, their editorial comments. And then I said, okay, I'll see you in a week, and they came back in a week and we repeated the exercise, and then we were done. Nobody could leave the room. Other staff couldn't leave the room. The only person who had possession of the document was me, and it never leaked. So we ultimately adopted the report. We went to the floor for a vote in front of the full House. And we were coming up on the end of the General Assembly, something you touched on before.
And we should say, I mean, just to remind people of fifth grade civics, when we have an election, as we will this November, you elect a legislature for a 2-year period.
Yes.
So this being 08, and we had just had an election, a new legislature was coming in.
Yes.
But
so the 94th...
The existing legislature was still seated.
Yes.
And you went to the vote.
Yes. So the 94th General Assembly, on one of its last acts, impeached the governor for cause by a unanimous vote with one exception. It was 117 to 1.
I think it might have been 116.
I think it was 116. I think somebody missed it. And I think I remember who that person was who missed the vote, too. But you're correct. There's only one no vote. And then the General Assembly adjourned sine die, which means it came to an end. The 94th General Assembly ended and the 95th General Assembly started. Do I have that wrong? Am I a year off? I may be a General Assembly off. It may have been the 95th ended. These years tend to blur together to me. But and then the very first thing that we did after being sworn in, the new General Assembly, is we took a vote over in the Sangamon Auditorium.
And literally, by the way, I mean, while the legislature was on the stage, having just been sworn in what, generally speaking, is a light-hearted day. Very just ceremonial normally. Ceremonial. You have there your family there, and you become a member of the Illinois General Assembly. So the House is sworn in on the stage, and then you actually hold one of the most significant votes in the history of the state.
Yes.
I mean, which was bizarre in a way.
It was bizarre. The whole thing was bizarre, Terry. This whole experience we're talking about calmly, but this was you were constantly trying to put a lid on a boiling pot. I mean, there were so many crazy things. I mean,
and why? Tell the people, since you had already voted, why did you vote again? Or maybe a better question would have been, as Speaker Madigan knew, and you knew, that the General Assembly was coming to an end, you were about to swear in a new one, why did you hold the December vote to impeach instead of just waiting for the new legislature to come in?
I think more than anything, just to be cautious. You know, there's that old phrase, belt and suspenders. It was really a belt and suspenders approach. Terry, there was no precedent for anything that we were doing. Everything was a blank slate, a blank canvas. And so we had to be very careful about everything we did. We had a governor who was not afraid of suing us and who had lots of lawyers and had spent lots of money already on lawyers. And he was going to be watching everything we did. Why did we take the first vote? Because if we adjourned with the committee never having taken a vote, there could be some argument made that we had failed to take the action and that we would have to start all over again with a new committee. It would have been a weak argument. It likely would have failed. But when all you have to do is take a vote to cure that problem, why not cure the problem? So my recommendation was, let's take the vote. We probably could have delivered that proclamation to the Senate, even though we adjourned. After we adjourned, the new Senate probably could have taken it up and it would have been valid. But again, there could have been an argument that that proclamation died with the 94th General Assembly. And so we said, why screw around?
Cover our legal basis and take a new vote.
Yeah, so we took a second vote. And we took it over in Sangamon, meaning we didn't even have a board to light up. We didn't have buttons to push. We took an oral vote. So that's a very dramatic oral vote to take, 118 members, one of whom is the governor's sister-in-law.
The governor's sister-in-law who voted not to impeach.
She voted no. She was the one no vote.
And
she's a
17-1 vote.
Yeah, it was 117-1, and you know, I remember seeing her that day, and that was not a fun day for her. And she's a very, very classy person. She's a good friend of mine, and I really respect her, and I respect how she handled that day. I can't even imagine how hard it would have been for her. But everything was weird. Everything was bizarre. Everything was awkward. You know, we were all sort of looking at each other like, "Are we really doing this? We're impeaching a governor." Up to that point, at least, I don't think I've ever gotten chills like I got when I was standing there with Speaker Madigan when that first vote was taken in the House.
Let's talk a little, and this may get into certain areas that you can't talk about, but when the governor was arrested by the feds, then obviously they had an investigation going on, which is why they arrested him to begin with.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They had wiretaps on. Now, first of all, just to back up, had the Speaker or you, did anyone in the legislature have any knowledge that the governor was being wiretapped or that there was an ongoing federal investigation?
Not any official knowledge. I mean, we all thought that was true. We all read the papers. We all saw Tony Rezko be convicted. We all heard the rumors that some of the people around him were being interviewed and were agreeing to cooperate. The day before he was arrested, I think, was when the Chicago Tribune published a big story about how John Wyma was cooperating and how the governor's phones were being tapped. But I just knew what anybody else knew from reading the paper. I'd never talked to the FBI about Rod Blagojevich. I don't know if the Speaker had or not. He probably wouldn't have talked to me about it if he had. You know, I'm his state lawyer. I wouldn't have been working on anything like that.
So then going back to where we were, you take the vote on the very, moments after the new legislature is sworn in.
Yeah.
And they vote to impeach.
Yeah.
Which means that it doesn't mean removal, it's basically an indictment. It means there's enough evidence to support a trial of whether the governor should be removed.
That's exactly the way to say it.
Now, and then ironically, as if this wasn't an ironic enough situation, we have, from the depths of one of the most tragic moments in Illinois history, the legislature breaks to go to Washington, D.C. for the swearing in of the first president of the United States from Illinois since Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And so then we're all up in, members of the legislature, then Lieutenant Governor Quinn, everyone's in Washington for Barack Obama's inaugural.
Yeah.
They're going to come back and then have the trial in the Senate. And you have to be preparing for that. How did you prepare to, as the prosecutor, how did you prepare for that trial?
Well, I had not initially thought I was going to be the prosecutor, so the first thing I did after we impeached him was I started communicating with people who I thought would be the House prosecutor. In the United States Congress, obviously the House of the congressmen and congresswomen themselves were the House managers who went over to, for example, with the Clinton impeachment, who prosecuted Clinton in the Senate. The actual elected members did. We could have done that. It was pretty clear the Senate did not want that. So then the question is, well, who did they want, or who would they be willing to accept, and who would we be willing to accept if it couldn't be the members? And so I had some ideas. I probably won't share those names, but there's names you would come up with probably, Terry, if we sat here and if you guessed. Really good lawyers from Springfield or from Chicago, above reproach, kind of above the taint of partisanship. And I was more than happy to hand everything off to those people and say, nice knowing you. Good luck. I'll help you whatever you need, but I'm going to go see my family a little bit now. But they decided that they wanted me to do it instead, probably because they knew that I'm not a showboaty sort of guy and that I would respect the process. I'd put the process before my own, personal, aggrandizement. Sometimes with private lawyers, they want to promote themselves and what they do, which is fine. So by the time I knew that I was going to be doing it, I had about 2 weeks to get ready for it. What do you do when your best evidence does not have a witness to present it? What do you do when your best evidence is an 88-paragraph affidavit connected to an application for arrest warrant in federal court that has an FBI agent's signature on it? The U.S. Attorney's Office, we made a decision early on that we were going, as the House, we were going to respect the U.S. Attorney's direction on what evidence we could use and not use. For example, whom we could contact to ask them to testify before the impeachment committee. We would have loved to have had Tony Rezko come in and sit down and answer questions, and Lon Monk, and Bill Quinlan, his lawyer, and Rod Blagojevich himself. But the U.S. Attorney did not want us to do that. And I'm not breaching any confidences because we did most of this in writing, and those documents are all online today. They're public documents. They were part of the record. We asked them for permission to interview groups of people, and they generally said no. Could we have defied them? And I get that question a lot. The best answer I can give is I'm not sure. Could we have? Would it have been a crime for me to try to get Tony Rezko to talk to me? No, of course not. I could have tried. He probably would have taken the fifth, and so it would have been a fruitless exercise to fight. Could the U.S. Attorney have actually used the supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution and say you cannot talk to these people? Probably not. But we just decided we weren't going to interfere with his investigation. He, by the way, just for posterity's sake, he was actually, Pat Fitzgerald was very professional, very courteous, extended me every courtesy. So I'm not trying to sound negative.
Did you contact him? How did your office, so you contacted him?
I called him. Yeah, I called him right away, and I said, you probably have been following what we've been doing down here. He said, yeah, of course. And I said, we want everything we can get from you, from your investigation, but we are going to respect your direction. We're going to let you tell us what we can have and not have. And he appreciated that, and we had many conversations, a lot of written correspondence as well, and ultimately they came up with what they came up with, which the initial reaction was, we're sorry, but there's really very, very little we can actually give you. There were a few areas where they said we don't care about that, but mostly anything that we really cared about, they said we're just not gonna, we're gonna ask you to not go there, which meant all we had was the allegations from an FBI agent. We then sort of appealed to them. I went back and had another conversation with them, and I said, tapes. Can you give me any tapes at all? Is there anything you can do? There are some people out there who say there are no tapes, or how do you know it's Rod's voice? if I can have any number of the tapes, and I'm speaking now to the undercover recordings, either bugs in his office or home or taps on the different phones that were tapped. They had thousands of tapes. I said, could I have some of them? I would have liked all of them, but I know you're not going to give me all of them. Can you give me something? And they spent a long time trying to come up with a set of tapes that they could give that did not have the domino effect of affecting a bunch of other things, a discrete set of tapes. They ultimately settled on 4 tapes that they could give us that were relating to the alleged shakedown of the racetrack owner, Johnny Johnston. Most of them were conversations between Lon Monk and Rod Blagojevich. And so they had to give notice to the people who were on those tapes that they were going to seek to release those to me, and then we went to federal court and we fought about it. We litigated it for quite some time. I was relatively sure I was never going to see those tapes, that it was going to be tied up in litigation, and the Senate was not going to wait for me to get those tapes to start the trial. So I was very skeptical about getting them. But that was one of 2 significant things that the U.S. Attorney's Office did in terms of providing me information. The second thing they did was something that I got from them just before the trial began. So again, we're moving up onto we're a week. We're just a few days from trial. I still don't really have a way to present my most important information to the Senate. You know, the senators are accustomed to, they're not your typical jury. They're accustomed to a lot of excitement when they're down here. This is an exciting place for a legislator when we're in session. You've got 50 people an hour that want to talk to you. You've got thousands of bills moving. You've got everyone trying to get your ear and trying to be dramatic about what they want. So these people are used to some liveliness. They're not used to the dreariness of a courtroom. So I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I have to give them a presentation. I mean, they're not children, they're adults, but they want to be entertained to some extent. They want to have their attention kept. And I have a 88-paragraph, 70-some page document. That's not that exciting. It doesn't speak. It doesn't gesture. It doesn't. So, you know, how do I do that? The rest of the case, the non-criminal stuff, we actually did have some people who could testify about how he went around the legislature and all that. But the criminal stuff was the meat of this, Terry. That's what everybody was there for. So I went back to the U.S. Attorney, and you know, as they always did, they gave me lots of time. And Pat Fitzgerald himself met with me and his top lieutenants. You know, I had a whole room full of the top people there. So they were very respectful. They didn't say, who are you, you puny little state entity. They knew this was serious. They knew they hadn't given me anything. They felt bad about it. I could tell that they felt bad, but they were just trying to protect their investigation.
And by the way, for the record, was it just you, or did you have a team that worked with you?
Most of the time it was just me. The last time I went to see Pat and his lieutenants, there were 2 lawyers from Mayor Brown with me. One of whom, Mike Ford, I had been consulting with a little bit.
Who's Mayor Brown?
Mayor Brown, Rowan Ma is a Chicago law firm. They're an international.
Mayor Brown.
Mayor
Okay.
Brown, M-A-Y-E.
I just want to make sure that.
Mayor Brown is an international law firm, and Mike Ford had been working with me, and from the Republican side, State Representative Jim Durkin's brother, Tom Durkin, also worked at Mayor Brown. Tom Durkin was the guy who prosecuted Governor Dan Walker back in the 70s. He's an outstanding former federal prosecutor. So the 2 of them went with me just because they'd been working with me on many aspects of the case, you know, federal eavesdropping laws. I mean, there was a lot of stuff to digest.
They brought some background with.
Yeah, and they all knew Tom, and they were comfortable with Tom. But frankly, I did all the talking because I was the one with the hat in my hand. I was the one who needed something, and I gave my pitch to them. I said, look, you know, the governor is going to. Here's the problem. The governor's wrongdoing is so pervasive that anybody I could possibly talk to is either a defendant, a target, or a cooperating witness. And so everybody I could possibly want to talk to is no, 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 no. He's actually going to profit from his wrongdoing. He has disqualified everybody I could talk to. And so why should I be penalized for that? Why should the state of Illinois be penalized for that? And I also said to them, you know, I understand your federal investigation is extremely important. And I think the people of this state, the 6 or 7 million people in this state, care very much about justice for Rod Blagojevich. But that justice is going to come in 2 years. What I'm dealing with is he going to be our governor anymore? He's got 2 years
And
left
he'd
on his
already
term.
Obviously indicated he wasn't going to resign.
He wasn't going to resign. So what was more important to the people of this state at this moment? Whether he remains governor for the next 2 years or whether he gets convicted of crimes 2 years from now? I said, I think a lot of people in the state would say this impeachment is of greater urgency to them. And, you know, again, they were great. I mean, Fitzgerald and those guys, they were great. They were really nice people. And they said, we hear everything you're saying. We're going to try to do something to help you. We're going to try to do something to be cooperative as a fellow entity, you know. They have to do that from time to time, whether it's a foreign government or something else. They came back and said, you can talk to our FBI agent, the guy who signed that long affidavit. And so in addition to the tapes, I had an FBI agent. Now, they were not going to let the governor's lawyers cross-examine him ad nauseum for 6 days, which is what they would like to do. You know, they call it discovery. It'd be free discovery for the criminal case. So they put limits on what I could ask this agent. And basically, I don't know if you remember this, Terry, but basically all I could get was for him to orally confirm that everything was true. He wouldn't even read the document. I had to read the document to him, and he had to say, yeah, that happened. Yeah, that's true. That's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it is a Q&A, which is what you expect at a trial. I could ask questions and get answers. But then we still wanted it to be, again, something that would be captivating to people. Me reading 88 paragraphs and just saying, you know, Agent Kane, is everything I just read true and accurate at the time you signed this affidavit? Yes. You do that 88 times, it gets a little long in the tooth, right? So one thing we did was we put some graphics up. And I don't think if you were watching this on the internet you even saw the graphics. If you were watching it online, seeing the photos online, you probably saw it. But in the courtroom, what was happening was every time I went to a new allegation, a new paragraph of the affidavit, a board was flipped, kind of like Vanna White, flipping just a poster board on an easel that printed out the most salacious language from that particular paragraph.
And it was a way of getting the senators to focus.
Well, it was. It ended up working, I thought, very effectively. Something that I thought might be really dull was actually quite interesting. So every time I went to, okay, Agent Kane, let's go to paragraph 22. On each side of Agent Kane, one of my staff was flipping a new board up on the easel. There were about 200 or 300 cameras above the Senate chamber, the international media. Every continent was represented, right? 200 cameras went off every time a board flipped, and 59 chins of 59 state senators rose up and read it. So it was actually quite engaging for something that I was terrified was going to be boring. In fact, it was interesting. A guy down here who blogs, you know, for Capital Facts, he wasn't there. He was at home because I think he was sick, and he was watching it on the internet. Now, on the internet, the Senate camera, as you well know, it goes from speaker to speaker to speaker. You don't see the rest of the courtroom. And all he saw was me saying, reading the paragraph, and then the agent saying it's true. And he said, that's the most boring thing I ever saw. And I said to him later, Rich, you should have been there, because you know, the combination of the boards and the cameras, I mean, when 300 cameras go off over your head, there's something about that. And
it reminds you the world is watching.
The world is watching. And those words, you know, our case was Rod Blagojevich's words.
Let's talk about some of the pay-to-play schemes that we heard about. We learned that the governor wanted to raise $2.5 million by the end of last year, by the end of 2008, before the new ethics bill went into play. That would have obviously curtailed his ability to raise money. And in his haste to raise as much money as he could before that deadline, we learned about 3 schemes where the governor made the price of an official act a coerced campaign contribution. We heard about pediatric care reimbursements. The governor had promised to release $8 million in children's pediatric care reimbursements. Yet in the same breath that he mentioned that, he talked about getting $50,000 from Hospital Executive 1. What did he say? I'm going to do $8 million for them. I want to get Hospital Executive 1 for $50. He even contemplated, when he didn't get the contribution right away, breaking his commitment, holding up the money. You recall that long exchange between Deputy Governor A and the governor, ending with the governor asking, we could pull that back if we needed to. Budgetary concerns, right? And Deputy Governor A said, right.
You know, he kept saying it's not fair to get me just on allegations, just on somebody's affidavit. But what I kept saying is, yeah, but they're your words, Governor. It's not as if he's just saying, I observed the governor and this is the conduct that in my opinion he was committing. They had this guy on tape, so they were just using his own words against him. And he never denied they were his words. And then we listened to those 4 tapes that I was able to ultimately procure. And the best thing those 4 tapes did were to just show that, okay, there really are tapes. And that when the government describes those tapes in the affidavit, they really did get it word for word verbatim, because they did. We listened to those 4 tapes and you could follow in the affidavit, word for word verbatim. And it really was easy to tell it was Rod's voice. It was easy to tell. Rod's voice is distinctive. And so the governor wasn't denying he said those words, and that was always my argument, is look, you were caught on tape. If you have an innocent explanation for these words, come on in and give us the innocent explanation.
We should say, as I recall, the Senate trial, the impeachment trial, was 4 days.
Right.
The Illinois channel has aired, what was the last day, your summation, just because of time, and the governor's speech. On a personal level, when you're standing there, well, first of all, the governor didn't show up until the very last moment.
He showed up after the evidence was closed.
Yeah. And what was your read of, well, I want to ask, what was your read of that, but also as you're presenting that, in the moment, maybe your mind is focused on doing your job. And I've wondered then, when the governor did come up and gave his side of the story.
I want you to know, I never ever intended to commit a criminal act. I never in any conversation intended to violate any criminal law. All the conversations, warts and all, ought to be heard. This is not Richard Nixon and Watergate trying to keep the tapes from being heard. I want all the evidence heard. And I want it sooner rather than later, so I can clear my name and we can get on doing the things that matter most.
What was it like for you to be sitting there facing him on a personal level? What was going through your mind at that time as you were watching this?
Well, it's interesting because on one level, I'm kind of a civics geek and a student of politics, and so from a civics 101 standpoint, this is a fascinating moment in Illinois history. On another side of the coin, I'm a trial lawyer and I'm on trial right now, and this is the guy I'm against. This is my adversary giving his one shot. So I really wanted to hear what he said. I think I probably had a pen in my hand, but I don't think I wrote more than 2 or 3 words down. I just sat there and watched him. It was a speech that we had seen before, and heard before, I should say. He did not really say very much about the case that he hadn't already told Barbara Walters on national television, or The View, or whatever, all the different talk shows he went on, Rachel Maddow, complaining about the lack of evidence. Most of the speech was, I'm Rod Blagojevich and I had humble beginnings and I'm fighting for the little guy and all that. And when it was over, time for me, it flew by. It was a fairly long speech. I've watched it since then, but at the time it flew by for me. I was just sort of taking it all in and thinking, how am I going to respond to this? And when it was over, I huddled with my 2 lawyers, Mike Casper and Heather Wire-Vaught, who were my co-counsel and great lawyers that I trust a lot. And we had half an hour before I was going to give my rebuttal, and we thought, what do we do? People ask me, did you have your rebuttal ready? No, that's what a rebuttal is. You wait and hear what he has to say, and then you come back. I had no idea what Rod was going to say. I thought he might resign. I didn't know what he was going to do.
And by the way, when he was offered, Governor, the Chief Justice, who was the presiding judge in the impeachment, Tom Fitzgerald, said, Governor, you're welcome to stay. Governor Blagojevich, who was still the governor at that moment, chose to walk out of the chamber.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He wasn't going to be there for the vote. No, he did it his way, like he did everything else. Yeah, he just had no. There's a way you treat people. There's a process and there's an institution, and particularly when you come. He had been a state representative, but only for a couple terms. He was really a congressman who became governor, And when you come down here and you know nothing about the process, there's nothing wrong with being independent. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to shake things up. That's great. That's fine. You know, reform the process. But you do have to, you're working with people who are accustomed to a certain way of doing things. And if you're not willing to respect them, to at least say, okay, I'm going to try to change things, but I also know that you are where you are, and I'm going to work with you constructively, instead of just walk in and punch them in the face before they've even opened their mouth, before you have any idea what's going on. That's just no way to govern. And he treated the impeachment process the same way he had treated everything else in his term. So he gave his speech, and it was a pretty good speech. I've heard him give a lot of speeches. It was probably one of the better presentations of his speech. It was pretty impassioned. And one thought we had was that we didn't need to respond. The only opinion that really mattered here was the 59 people in the Senate, and they'd all heard this speech. And we didn't think they were probably swayed by it. But then I just thought about it again, and I thought to myself, the whole world is watching, and certainly the nation is watching, and most certainly the people of this state are watching right now. And a lot of them have not heard him speak 50 times. And a lot of them thought this was a really compelling presentation, and he shouldn't have the last word here. Especially when what I ultimately ended up saying in the closing rebuttal argument was demonstrated in his speech, which is that he gives a great speech. He's great on camera, but this trial is about what happens when he's not on camera. I mean, he basically wrote my rebuttal for me by doing what exactly he's been doing the whole time. His speech, his closing argument, was a microcosm of his problems. Great on camera, but when he's off camera, he's just doing all sorts of stuff he shouldn't be doing.
Wouldn't have it. Opportunities for health care, opportunities for education, opportunities for preschool. Try to level the playing field, but do it in ways that doesn't burden the middle class. A different approach, ruffling feathers here, not the kind of thing that everybody agreed with, but an approach that I thought would help families and not burden them, and give them a lift up a little bit and not have them just run in place, hearing a lot of stuff that the governor said he did, but not really feeling like their lives have improved.
Yeah, so we knew that we would have 30 minutes after the governor's closing argument to give our rebuttal, and we just went back to my office. Mike Casper and Heather Wyer-Vaught and I, the three of us, just went back and closed the door and said, what do we think? And I hadn't taken many notes during the governor's speech because I'd heard the speech before. There was nothing really of substance there. But it was a pretty good speech, and I thought, there was one thought that said, kind of like Rod didn't put on a defense in his criminal trial, there was some thought to say, maybe we shouldn't even dignify what he said with a response, just don't give a rebuttal. The main reason that I declined to do that and I decided to do a rebuttal was that this was something that the whole world was watching. This was one of the most watched events at this point, probably in the history of the world. I mean, that sounds like a big statement, but with YouTube being what it is, I mean, you know, a lot of people watch the O.J. Simpson trial, but not nearly as many as watch this impeachment trial at times because of the proliferation of the internet, which wasn't there. So this is the kind of scale of people. I've heard people from all different continents say, oh, I was in the West Indies and I was watching you.
Is that right?
Yeah. I was in the Cayman Islands. I was in Australia. You're on TV here. So I thought to myself, we can't let what he said go unstated. Not to mention the fact that his speech was a microcosm of what was wrong with him, which is he's very good on camera, but it's what he does when he's not on camera that no one sees where the problems lie. Here he gave a great speech in his closing argument about how he's fighting for the little people, how he's fighting for health care for children, how he's all about the working class. Well, then I've got behind me some boards that we produced from the affidavit where he's saying things like, oh, well, we're not going to reimburse that pediatric cancer center until their CEO gives me $50,000. Oh, we're not going to green light that road project, that massive road project, until we see how much money the road people pony up. It's his on-camera versus off-camera, and so his speech really sort of wrote my rebuttal. Most of what I did in my rebuttal was just contrast his speech to what he does when the cameras, he doesn't think the cameras are on, he doesn't think anyone's listening. That was the majority of what I did. And it was It was off the cuff. It was written on the back of an envelope. I had just a little envelope where I may have had 4 or 5 points. When you're at that stage of any trial as a lawyer, you've been living the trial, you've been thinking about it for weeks and weeks, if not years. You don't need many notes. It's coming from the heart. It was very, very emotional to me. It was the most emotional 8.5 minutes of my legal career, no question.
The rebuttal.
Absolutely, because it was just coming from the heart. It was probably the best 8.5 minutes of my legal career. And, you know, when it was over, I think, you know, a lot of people came up to me and offered me congratulations and, you know, good work and all that stuff. But the thing that I heard the most from people around this building, all of the thousands of people who work in the Capitol, was thank you. Not thank you for convicting the governor. Thank you for saying what we've all wanted to say. That's what we wanted to say. That here's this guy been parading around in front of the cameras acting like he's this philanthropic, Good Samaritan guy, when we all know that behind closed doors he's doing a lot of dirty stuff. Thank you for being the person to actually point that out. You spoke for thousands of people. I felt like I was speaking for millions of people when I was giving that speech. And in fact, I remember just before I said the first word in my rebuttal, standing at the podium looking over the Senate, I just had a moment where I thought, there are so many people's voices who I'm channeling right now. Very, very powerful moment, and you know, something I'll always be proud of. And then, of course, when we went to the vote and we got the vote that we had asked for, he was convicted by all 59 members, and he was barred from holding future elective office.
What did Speaker Madigan? When you were putting together, and we had talked earlier about you working with Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
To what extent did Speaker Madigan have any role in your preparation? Did he just say, "You're my lawyer, do your job, and I'm out of it"? And did you go back and say, "Here are the points that I'm going to make"? You know, what was the Speaker's role in the impeachment process vis-a-vis yourself? Yeah,
the Speaker is an extremely misunderstood person.
He is, for those who don't know, an enigma.
Yeah.
He's a very private.
He's very private. He's not out there in the front lines trying to get his name in the paper or his picture in the paper. He's a great guy. I don't know how else to say it, but he's a great guy. And anybody who's worked with him closely would be able to tell you what I'm about to tell you in answer to your question, which is he gave me all the room I needed. He said, you know, if you need something from me, just ask. If you have questions of me, call me. But you're the lawyer, you're the House prosecutor, do what you think is right. I would give him some updates from time to time. He never gave me any direction on how to prosecute the case. Now, I'm talking now of my role as House prosecutor. There is a very big difference between being the House prosecutor in the Illinois Senate and being the counsel to the impeachment committee. It was actually called the Special Investigative Committee in the House. He was very hands-on in the House. I mean, he wanted to know what was going on, and he helped guide that whole process. I want to make that clear. But once I was named House prosecutor, I was sort of a cowboy out there on my own in the Senate. And he just said, you know, if you need something from me, let me know. A couple times during the couple weeks leading up, he called me and said, you know, how you doing? You know, what do you need? Do you have questions? But for the most part, he said, I picked you, I trust you. When I give my people responsibility, I expect them to be able to handle it and to let me know if they can't. And, you know, and I did my job. I mean, we did not talk very, very much during those few weeks of prep or during the trial.
What about any other members of the House, either from the Democratic caucus or from the Republican caucus?
From the House? There was a point in time very close to the time we went to trial where I didn't know I was going to have an FBI agent to put on the stand to talk about the criminal allegations. Mm-hmm. And so what we were going to do instead, I don't know if you know this or not, but what we were going to do is bring in the House members and have a question and answer with them. You know, as I said before, I knew that the senators who were going to be the judges and jurors were going to be expecting a back and forth, a Q&A like any trial. There was no precedent for this trial, so it didn't have to look like that, but that's what I thought everyone expected. So what I did was I broke up the allegations on the criminal side into its various parts, the Senate seat, the Tribune, Children's Memorial, the racetrack, and I had a different representative assigned to each one. Jim Durkin was going to talk about the Illinois Senate. I believe Gary Hanig was going to talk about the Chicago Tribune, etc. Susanna Mendoza was going to talk, Art Turner, Connie Howard. And they were going to literally sit there, and I was going to say, what does the affidavit say next about what happened? And they would give an answer, and then I would say, okay, let me turn your attention to this paragraph. What does the affidavit say happened the next day? Now, this is very odd. If you're a trial lawyer, you're saying, well, that's hearsay on top of hearsay. And that they would be right to say that. But it was all we had. So I was dealing a lot with a certain group of the House membership, getting them ready for the trial. Once I knew I had the FBI agent, I made the decision, and it was just my decision, that I was going to go that route and not use any of the members.
It's not so much, I would say, like anyone who's written a speech or something, or
Yeah.
you're a news reporter putting together a story, you start off thinking the process of how you might do this, and then it ends up taking a certain path.
It does, and most people, when they're preparing for a trial, they have a lot of things to think about, but they don't have to think about how am I going to create the forum to actually present the evidence. Usually that's all governed by rules of evidence, but I didn't have rules of evidence, not really, not much, and but more than anything, I didn't have a witness, so I didn't have the person to give the first-hand account. I didn't even have a second-hand account, really, so I made do with what I had.
I'm curious of a couple of things. One, I want to get to, we don't have any standard, as we talked earlier, for impeachment. You can impeach them just because you don't like them. If you can get the votes, you can impeach them.
Yeah.
I want to go to whether we should have more concrete standards. But before we get into that, while we're still on reflections, now that you have had, hard to believe, coming up a year and a half, going on 2 years.
Yeah. It's amazing to believe that.
It is. It almost seems like a couple of months ago.
Yeah, it does to me.
How often do you reflect back, and to what extent are you content with the job that you did, or is there something that you go, I wish in retrospect we would have done something different?
I can't think of anything that I would have done differently, and I'm a fairly self-critical person, but we certainly didn't have very much time. I suppose that if there was another way I could have presented the main part of the evidence, I might have, I would have welcomed that, but I still to this day can't think of any other way I could have done it. I always thought that the process was more important than the result, and that's something the Speaker and I discussed very, very early on, back before we'd even impeached him. That the governor had made the state a laughingstock. And we could compound that problem by making this whole procedure a circus. And we weren't going to do that. We're the adults in the room, The governor may not be the adult, but we're going to be. We're going to do a process the right way. Maybe he's impeached, maybe not. When we were in the House, I didn't care if he was impeached or not. I just cared about doing it the right way. Yes, I thought he was probably going to be impeached. I think most people thought he was going to, but that was never my concern. It was doing everything fairly, giving his lawyers all the process that is due. I think if you ask Eddie Jensen, did Dave Ellis give you a fair shake? Eddie Jensen is Governor Blagojevich's lawyer at the time. Ed Jensen, famous Chicago lawyer, now a good friend of mine. I'd never met him before. I think if you asked him, did he get a fair shake from me, he would say yes. He gave me, if I wanted a document, I got it. I gave him notice of everything. I gave him transcripts of hearings every night. I went far beyond what a lot of the members probably wanted me to do because I didn't want anyone to say that the governor got railroaded, that he didn't have a fair shake. Once we get to the Senate, well, now I'm an advocate. Now I have a different role. Now I'm trying to win something. But it still mattered. The process still mattered. I didn't want anyone to say this was a kangaroo court. I didn't want anyone to say this governor did not get due process. One of the low points of this entire proceeding was when I learned conclusively that the governor was not going to show up. And one of my friends that day called and said, hey, congratulations, your opponent's not even coming. How much easier for you to win? And I said, this is the worst thing that could have happened. because now he's going to try to make this into a circus. And now it's going to be a rather odd proceeding. You're trying a governor, and there's nobody defending it. Nobody.
And speaking of circus, I think it was even during the impeachment trial, one of the early days, that he was out in New York, I believe, on a TV show.
It was every day, Terry. Every day that we were on trial, except when he flew in at the last minute to give his speech. He was on national television somewhere talking about how unfair the process was. And the truth was, you know, if it's so unfair, come and talk to us. So that was actually something I was not happy about. I wanted Ed Jensen or Sam Adams Jr. or whoever the governor wanted to come and put up a fight. I was confident that I could defend my position. I wanted that. I wanted that dialogue. I wanted him to come in and give all of the evidence he could possibly give to defend himself and say, give me another chance, whatever it was going to be, and let the chips fall where they may. I wouldn't have enjoyed losing. Nobody likes to lose, but the process would have been the better for it. But I couldn't control that. All I could control was my own demeanor. I asked the Senate to put a gag order on me. I had so many phone calls from the media, I mean, from around the world, it just is breathtaking. You know, a guy like me, I'm not used to that kind of attention. I didn't want it. I didn't want to talk on camera. I didn't want this to be about me. I didn't want to do anything in a glorified manner. I kept my head down. I presented my evidence every day. I walked out with my head down and went back to my office and didn't talk to anybody except the other lawyers. I'm proud of that. I'm proud that I respected the process. I gave that process all the respect I could. I think the senators did. I know the House members did. I think everybody in both chambers found it to be a very emotional experience. I had the same kind of reactions with the senators afterwards that I did with the House members after we voted to impeach, where everybody was hugging each other and thinking about it and saying, in some ways this is one of the worst days in Illinois, and in some ways maybe it's one of the proudest days in Illinois. It's kind of both, and all at the same time. Very emotional. You know, when I saw those things, I realized that the institution and the process mattered to all these people, and I felt like maybe that meant maybe I'd been doing something right.
You know, one reflection is that for all of us who work in the Capitol, whether you're lobbyists or lawmakers or media, and something that won't be remembered except by those who were in the Capitol during the Blagojevich years, is that there was kind of a black cloud hanging over the Capitol, that it was just a dysfunctional time and nothing seemed to be working.
That's right.
Or to the extent that it worked, it was like running on an engine without oil in it. I mean, it was just a grind.
Yeah. I can't imagine a legislative process going through during this era, during this time period. I mean, he got arrested after veto session and before the new session started, and I think the reason John Cullerton, the new incoming Senate president, wanted the trial right away was for the very reason you gave, Terry. I think he thought to himself, there's no way we can conduct the business of the people, hold committee hearings and listen to bills and, you know, to do any of that until we've decided what we're going to do about this governor. So,
Rod Blagojevich, you know, is impeached. We'll get to some, should there be some changes, but let me also ask now, too, that as we sit here, the jury is out. Mm-hmm. They're deciding his fate. From what has transpired since the impeachment and the federal case, what are your reactions? I suspect you don't know anything more than what any of us know, and I presume, but were there any surprises, any reflections on how the trial has gone?
You're right to say that I don't know anything much more than the average person. I probably know the evidence better just because I studied it so closely. But beyond that, I don't have any inside information. I don't talk to the prosecutors. I talked to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office a very little bit leading up the trial, just because they were trying to gather technical information for the trial, like the bill, the racetrack bill that was the subject of the alleged extortion, that kind of thing. So I don't have any inside information beyond that. I was surprised that that the governor and his lawyer promised to testify and then didn't. You notice I didn't say I'm surprised he didn't testify. I'm surprised he promised he was going to and then didn't. He never should have made that promise if he wasn't going to.
And he was always, as a reminder to people, one of his statements was that he wanted to get all the evidence out, wait till he gets his chance to have his say and clarify the record.
Yeah, oh yeah, he would always say that. I'm the opposite of Nixon. I want all the tapes played. I want to shout from the loudest billy pulpit my innocence and explain everything. And for whatever reason, strategically, he decided not to. He probably made the right decision. When you are in federal court, there's a lot of things they could have asked him that went beyond the evidence they had presented. He would have had a lot of explaining to do. I think it would have been a very, very difficult cross-examination for him. But then he shouldn't, I wished he hadn't promised it. Sam Jr., I don't know him very well, but I got to know him. I'm sorry, Sam Adams Jr., the lead counsel for the governor in the federal criminal trial, was also one of the lawyers down here in Springfield for a while with Eddie Jensen. And he's a very good lawyer. And I found him to be a good guy, too. I thought all of the governor's lawyers were very nice and professional. So I don't want to be sitting here second-guessing him from my armchair because he knows what he was doing. And he's a very good lawyer. But I will say what a lot of other people have said. I'm surprised he made the promise and then had to break it. I think that...
I was surprised, my own, that the prosecution, it seemed that they ignored certain things. We had the allegations of, well, again, the skirting the veterans' preference in hiring,
yes.
The Health Facilities Planning Board, and trying to allegations of corruption in there.
Yeah.
That it seemed to me that there was so much we heard about during the Blagojevich years that the amount that went to trial was far less. Now, maybe that's just part of the legal system that you prioritize and take, as a lawyer, your best shot.
Yeah, and you take the things that you can prove the most. There are a lot of things that people think they know, but they couldn't prove in court. A lot of things you couldn't tie directly to the governor. They were protective of the governor. They tried to keep things away from him, it appears. It seems like his close circle, some of whom are either deceased or in federal custody right now, went to lengths not to link things directly to the governor. They try to protect the guy at the top. I think you saw a little bit of that in the George Ryan administration, too. Some of that stuff, maybe they just couldn't link back to him. I don't know. These federal prosecutors are very quiet about what they do, and so they don't explain why they didn't do things. There has been some talk about why they didn't call Tony Rezko, for example, who is one of his top fundraisers, and he's in federal custody right now, probably looking at a pretty long sentence. I say federal custody. He's been convicted of many offenses in federal court. I don't know why they didn't call him, but I doubt very seriously that they were tricked by the governor's people into thinking that the governor would testify and they would use him later. I've read people who speculated that they were holding Rezko back until after Blagojevich testified. I'd be very surprised if they fell for that trick because defendants often don't testify, and they had to know that was a possibility. So I have to come to the conclusion that they took a look at Rezko, who had some warts on him, and they probably said we've got enough evidence of what Rezko was doing with Patty and with the governor without having to call Rezko. These are pretty smart lawyers over there on the prosecution side. Now
that we have gone through this as a state, should there be, what conclusions do we draw? Do we say, well, that was a storm and we passed by it, as we kind of as a nation did with the Nixon impeachment at time? Or should there be some legislative reflections, commissions on the removal of a governor? Should we set in concrete any standards, or what are your thoughts, having gone through this? Yeah, well, when you look at the impeachment process as a whole, when you look at the absence of a burden of proof, when you look at the absence of rules of procedure or rules of evidence, when you look at the absence of any specificity in the language, when it just says cause for impeachment by a simple majority of the House,
what you see throughout that is that we are putting trust in the legislative branch. And when you trust the legislative branch, what you're really trusting is that they will react in a political way. That they know that whatever they do, they're going to have to go back to their districts and explain themselves to the voters. You know, when I talk to judges and lawyers about the impeachment process, they go crazy because of the absence of all of these things. You know, they think of jurors not talking about the case when they go home at night. Well, members of the House of Representatives, or of the Senate in this case, when they leave the chamber, they go back to their districts and they talk about whatever it is they're doing, including this.
Or they're talking to the press.
Or they're talking to the press, which is another way these days of reaching your constituents. It's probably the most effective way these days. There is political pressure to do what you think your people want you to do. And I think that is what keeps this from being a completely overused tool, because the public generally has common sense and they would not react well to people doing this. It's worked. We've only had to impeach one governor in the lifetime of our state, which is since 1818. Okay, so we're coming up on almost 200 years now, almost. And we've only done this once. We've only even tried really seriously to do it one time. There was never even serious grumblings about impeaching anybody else. That is proof in the pudding right there that it will not be abused. But you know, you can hold the whole process up and say there ought to be a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, or you at least ought to say that it's either crimes or serious wrongdoing. But the truth is the political accountability seems to hold that all in check. People, you know, in Congress, the Bill Clinton impeachment was not terribly popular at the time. People weren't happy with what the president had done, but they didn't seem to think they wanted him removed from office. The Senate reacted to that. If there had been a hue and cry nationally, if every state was 90% in favor of getting that bum out of office, that kind of thing, my guess is the Senate would have convicted him and removed him. But they were looking at their polls. They were looking at their constituents. That sounds counterintuitive when we normally think of criminal cases with juries, but that's exactly how it's supposed to happen. They're supposed to go back and hold town hall meetings and saying, who thinks I should vote to convict? Who thinks I should vote to acquit? As odd as that may seem, there's nothing wrong with that, and that was actually what was intended. I think it's a healthy thing, and the more we would restrain the discretion of these legislators, I think the worse off we'd be.
Let's talk just a little before we wrap up. Since we spent the entire time as your role in the impeachment, tell us a bit. I think it's always good for people to understand some about the process.
Yeah.
What does the counsel to the House Speaker typically do?
Yeah.
Because impeachment, of course, is not typical.
It's not typical. I guess I wear a few hats. One is that I'm the parliamentarian, and so I preside over the House hearings to the extent there is a need for a parliamentary ruling. I don't preside as the elected officer, but I will decide points of order if there are disputes. I will decide vote requirements if there's a question as to whether a bill requires a simple majority or an extra majority, a supermajority we call it. There are a few instances in the law where you have to have 71 votes to pass it in the House instead of 60. I'm the guy who would decide that. Other than that, just basic parliamentary inquiries fall under the parliamentarian. That's probably the least time-consuming of the things that I do. I happen to also be the House ethics officer for the House Democrats. So we have a lot of ethics laws these days, and there are always questions as to whether a legislator can accept a certain gift, or whether they're allowed to print something on state letterhead versus campaign letterhead. You know, can I use state money for this? All those kinds of things that invoke our state ethics laws, I will give them advice, sometimes in writing, sometimes just informally. The predominant thing that I do is I review legislation, and I help draft some legislation. Some of probably the more significant stuff I'll have a hand in negotiating or maybe drafting. You know, the Speaker is obviously the top officer of the House, and he controls the committees and the rules, and so, you know, if something is important enough, significant enough, either because it's a lot of money involved or for whatever reason, sometimes I'll be asked to step in and help mediate a dispute or something. A good example would be the nursing home legislation we just passed last year. I led a series of meetings. I didn't do nearly the work that the other people in the committee, in the group did, but I shepherded it. I sort of oversaw it and helped try to get to a final conclusion. That's an example of something I might do. On a more fundamental day-to-day basis, every bill that is filed in the House is reviewed by the Speaker, usually with me. There's other directors who will sometimes review it with him too, but the predominant amount of the legislation, I will read it, the Speaker will read it, and we will talk about it and assign it to a committee. He'll assign it. I don't assign anything. But I will say, here's House Bill whatever, this is what it does. He might have some questions for me. Some of the other members in leadership might say, here's something I don't understand about that bill. I'll explain those things. If I don't understand the bill well enough, I'll say I'll have to come back. We will work 6 or 8 hours at a time sometimes. We'll come in on a Sunday and start at 9 and work until 4 in the afternoon. We almost have a regular Sunday meeting every week of the session where the Speaker will go painstakingly through every bill. People don't know that about him, but he reads every bill.
Is that right?
Yeah.
We should also note like Scott Turow, who was I think he still is a working lawyer, isn't he?
Yeah, I think he is.
And became a famous author. One of your interesting sidelines is that you've also are a writer of nonfiction books and have had, how many, 6 published now?
6 fiction. 6 fiction books.
I'm sorry, yes, I meant to say fiction books. It was also on my mind whether or not you've actually thought of writing an account of this impeachment process or not.
I was asked to write a nonfiction account. My publisher asked me if I had any interest, and some other people approached me, and I said no, mostly because I'm a fiction writer, but also because I would have to breach too many confidences. Nobody who worked with me did so with the understanding that I might repeat what they said to me into a book, and even though I might technically have the right to do it, I don't think I'm going to exercise that right. But what's funny is I was I'm basically on a schedule where I write a book a year with my publisher. That's what they want me to do. And I was slowing down since I've had this job with the Speaker, in large part because of the governor we had and all the civil war that was going on. And I explained this to my publisher when they said, you're slowing down, we need to get another book from you, what's going on? I told them that we had this crazy governor, and you've never heard of him, and you couldn't pronounce his name, but he's crazy. And they said, well, crazy like interesting crazy? And I said, I suppose it's somewhat interesting. And they said, why don't you write a book about it? So I said, okay, I'll think about that. And so back in 2008, after 2007 was a year where we never really left session. We never got out of session in 07 because the governor kept calling special sessions. We had a little bit of breathing room in 08, and I said, I'm going to finish a book I'm writing about a corrupt governor, a fictional governor, maybe borrowing a little bit from Blagojevich, not too on the nose, but based on him, let's say. And in December, I was in a mad rush to get my book done. Well, here comes December 9th, 2008, and he gets arrested. And suddenly, the stuff I'm writing about pales in comparison to what's really going on. A truth becomes far stranger than my fiction. And I couldn't write that book anymore because I knew the moment that I heard all these sensational allegations that any book that I wrote, people would expect something somewhat sensational, and it would just be so boring by comparison. So I ripped my book up. I had to start over. But I did write the book, and it's coming out next year.
Do you have a title?
Breach of Trust. Breach of Trust. It'll be out, I think, January or February of next year. It's about a corrupt governor.
And you actually also, your first book won the Edgar Allan Poe Award for what, original first novel?
Best first novel by an American author. Yeah. Yeah.
And why, given all that you do and having Sunday meetings, why do you write books, or how do you find the time?
I write books because I love writing books. I would go crazy if you took that away from me. I'm just how I'm wired now. So I find the time. I usually, if you've noticed the circles under my eyes, it's because I work late at night. I was up till 2 a.m. last night writing. I try to fit in. I've got a young family, so I want to have time for my family. But at some point, everybody else goes to bed, and I just don't go to bed. I stay up and go up to my attic, and I work for a few hours and just get a little less sleep. But it's a labor of love. It's what I want to do.
Well, David Ellis, maybe we can delve into that
Yeah.
at another time a little
Great.
bit more. That's interesting, but
Great.
just wanted to mention, because people may note, isn't that guy's the same name as that author?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we thank you for taking the time. You're, I know, a student of history, and you probably never imagined you would be quite a participant in
No.
such a historical
Never.
chapter of Illinois history. But we thank you for sharing your insights, and hopefully, not only for the people who watch this week, but 50 or 60 or 100 years from now, that they'll have some greater insight of this chapter that we all went through.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure, Terry. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.